In September 1939, when General Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions crossed the Polish border at dawn, Germany's military machinery was the most modern and coordinated the world had ever seen. In less than 2 years, Germany would have conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Its troops patrolled from the English Channel to the banks of the Dnieper. The world held its breath. Yet by May 1945, Berlin was a field of scorched rubble, its chancellery reduced to ruins, and Adolf Hitler was a corpse in the backyard of that very building. How did the most powerful regime in continental Europe come to that point of total destruction in just 6 years? The answer is not simple, but it is also not an absolute mystery. Military historians, from academic John Keegan to strategic analyst David Pine, have pointed out a series of concrete decisions, calculable errors, moments when the chessboard of war offered winning moves that were ignored, underestimated, or directly sabotaged by the irrationality of a single man. This is not about romanticizing the Third Reich or imagining worlds where fascism triumphs. It is about understanding, with historical rigor and analytical coldness, the mechanisms by which a power with the real capacity to dominate continental Europe was systematically led toward its own destruction. Dunkirk, the day Britain almost lost its army. May 24, 1940, the Ardennes. The last units of the British Expeditionary Force, more than 400,000 British and French soldiers, retreat toward the coast of the English Channel along roads choked with dust, abandoned vehicles, and the intermittent roar of Stukas overhead. General Heinz Guderian's panzers are less than 25 kilometers from the port of Dunkirk. In terms of armored vehicle advance speed, the distance amounts to just a few hours of combat. In those hours, one of the most debated episodes of the entire war unfolds. On May 24th, Adolf Hitler issued Supreme Headquarters Directive 13, ordering the Wehrmacht panzer units to stop and hold their positions. The order came directly from the Führer without consulting the tank commanders on the ground. General Ewald von Kleist, commanding the panzer group advancing toward Dunkirk, was bewildered. General Guderian, whose divisions were only 15 kilometers from the port, found himself reading an order that contradicted everything the Blitzkrieg doctrine prescribed, the relentless exploitation of success. The reasons Hitler gave for halting the advance were multiple and have been debated by historians for 8 decades. The commander of Army Group A himself, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had recommended a pause to consolidate positions and repair damaged tanks before moving south against the remaining French forces. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and the second man in the regime, promised that his bombers could destroy the forces trapped in Dunkirk from the air without committing the tanks. The marshy terrain around Dunkirk, Hitler recalled from the mud of the Great War, was ill-suited for armored vehicles. These tactical arguments may have carried some weight, but the consequence was unequivocal. The pause lasted 36 hours at its most critical, and the Allied forces used that time in a way history would record as one of the most extraordinary evacuations of the 20th century. Operation Dynamo, directed by Rear Admiral Bertram Ramsay from the tunnels beneath Dover Castle, mobilized between May 26th and June 4th, 1940. A total of 861 vessels, Royal Navy destroyers, fishing boats, lifeboats, private yachts, anything that could float and cross the channel. Under the constant fire of the Luftwaffe and German artillery, approximately 338,226 Allied soldiers were evacuated to the English coast. Of these, around 198,000 were British and roughly 140,000 were French and Belgian. Historian Michael Burley, in his book Moral Combat, A History of World War II, 2011, describes the beaches of Dunkirk during those days as a surreal and Dantean landscape. Kilometers of sand darkened by oil from sunken ships, endless columns of soldiers wading into the water up to their waists to reach vessels that could not approach the shore, the buzzing of Messerschmitts attacking in low passes, and bodies returned by the sea. 40,000 soldiers were captured, including the entire 51st Highland Division, surrounded elsewhere on the French coast by Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. The army that was evacuated reached England without its heavy equipment. 2,472 guns, 63,879 vehicles, and 76,000 tons of ammunition were left on the beaches and roads of Flanders. Now then, what would have happened if the panzers had not stopped? If Guderian had received the order to advance instead of halt, his tanks would have reached the docks at Dunkirk before the evacuation could be organized. 400,000 soldiers, including the core of Britain's entire professional army, its most experienced officers, its best-trained troops, the men who in later years would command divisions in North Africa, Italy and Normandy, would have fallen prisoner. Britain would have lost not just the equipment, which was replaceable, but the human structure of its armed forces. Winston Churchill himself, according to journalist William Shirer in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, 1960, acknowledged before his war cabinet the magnitude of the catastrophe that might have been. On May 28th, with the evacuation still underway and its outcome uncertain, Churchill summoned the ministers of the Foreign Office and essentially told them that if the British Expeditionary Force were destroyed or captured, England would have no choice but to negotiate. Not with Hitler under his current conditions, he added, but negotiate nonetheless. The evacuation of Dunkirk preserved the military backbone of Britain, and Britain, as long as it stood, constituted a fundamental strategic obstacle to any consolidation of German victory on the continent. It was the base from which Allied bombers would later operate against German factories. It was the starting point from which, in June 1944, 3 million soldiers would cross the English Channel. It was the place where American Lend-Lease shipments delivered war materials. Dunkirk was not the victory that the British celebrated as such in their newspapers on June 4th. It was the survival of the instrument with which 4 years later they would destroy the Reich. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, years after the war, in statements recorded by historian Basil Liddell Hart in The Other Side of the Hill, 1948, called the decision to halt the panzers one of the great turning points of the war. It was a personal assessment based on direct experience. Rundstedt had been the commander of Army Group A, the force that had trapped the Allies at Dunkirk. From his perspective, the decision was not his. It had come from Berlin, and from Berlin it had sealed the impossibility of quickly finishing off Britain. There is an additional irony in all this. In his political testament, dictated on February 26, 1945, when Berlin was burning and the Soviet army was closing in, Hitler claimed that he had shown a sportsmanlike spirit by not annihilating the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk, hoping that Churchill would appreciate the gesture and negotiate. No contemporary documents support this version. What the documents do confirm is that Directive 13 of May 1940 explicitly ordered the annihilation of the Allied forces in the Flanders pocket, and that it was the chaos in the German chain of command, combined with Göring's promises, that halted the tanks, not a deliberate political calculation by Hitler. The story the dictator told about himself in his final hours had little to do with the facts. The Battle of Britain, when the Luftwaffe had victory in its grasp, July 1940, southern England, the pilots of No. 11 Group of the Royal Air Force under the command of Air Vice Marshal Keith Park wait in the ready rooms of the airfields at Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch and Tangmere. The temperature in those rooms is high, flight suits smell of rubber and gasoline, and the phone that summons aircraft can ring at any moment. Outside, 25 kilometers away, the English Channel glitters under the August sun. On the other side, in the airfields of France and the recently conquered Netherlands, more than 2,600 Luftwaffe aircraft await the order to attack. The Battle of Britain is perhaps the most analysed episode of the entire Second World War. It has generated films, series, memoirs, and academic studies. But within that mass of analysis, there is one detail that repeats like a chorus in almost every serious account. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe came close to destroying the RAF. And then, because of a decision personally made by Hitler on September 7, 1940, the RAF was saved. To understand what was at stake, one must first grasp the nature of the aerial duel that had been unfolding over the skies of southern England since July 10, 1940. The German plan, codenamed Adlertag or Eagle Day, aimed to destroy the RAF's fighting capability as a precondition for Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion of the southern coast of England. The objective was not to destroy aircraft in the air, but to destroy the infrastructure that made those aircraft operational, the airfields, fuel depots, repair workshops, and above all, the radar network that allowed ground controllers to direct RAF fighters toward German bomber formations before they reached their targets. The British air defence system, known as the Dowding system in honour of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who designed it, was by August 1940 the most sophisticated in the world. Its chain-home radar stations, installed between 1937 and 1940 along the southern and eastern coasts of England, could detect German aircraft formations the moment they took off from French airfields. The information flowed through telephone lines to underground operations rooms, where controllers coordinated the fighter response. It was a system that multiplied the effectiveness of every Spitfire and Hurricane, allowing fighters with limited fuel to intercept the Germans at the optimal place and time instead of wasting hours patrolling without contact with the enemy. And in August 1940, that system was being systematically destroyed. From August 12th onward, the Luftwaffe had modified its tactics and concentrated its attacks on RAF airfields and radar stations. The results were devastating. The Biggin Hill airfield, one of the most important in the defensive system, was attacked and heavily damaged 6 times between August 18th and 31st. Its runways were rendered unusable at various times, its hangars destroyed, its control towers demolished. RAF historians have calculated that in the last week of August, the rate of pilot and aircraft losses was such that if it had continued for another 2 or 3 weeks, Park's No. 11 group would have been left without real operational capacity. Historian Richard Overy, in his work The Battle of Britain, 2000, notes that by the end of August 1940, the RAF had lost 231 fighters in combat and had another 161 under repair. The capacity to produce new fighters was about 500 aircraft per month, higher than the German rate, but the bottleneck was pilots, not planes. Between August 24th and September 6th, the RAF lost 103 pilots killed and 128 seriously wounded out of a total of approximately 1,000 operational fighter pilots. Replacements could not be trained at that pace. The situation was not unknown to the German High Command. Luftwaffe intelligence reports, though inaccurate in several respects, indicated that the RAF was in difficulty. And then came what military historians have unanimously described as one of the most serious strategic errors of the entire war. On August 24, 1940, a group of Heinkel R-111 bombers lost their bearings and dropped their payload over central London instead of the industrial targets in the suburbs that had been assigned to them. Churchill's response was immediate. He ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin with 81 Vickers Wellington bombers that very same night. The damage was minimal. The German defensive system was effective over the territory of the Reich, but the psychological impact was enormous. Berlin had been bombed. The Nazis had promised that this was impossible. Hermann Göring, who had sworn before the German people that no bomb would fall on the capital, was humiliated. Hitler, who was convinced that Britain would negotiate in the short term, was enraged. On September 7th, he issued the order that RAF pilots would remember for the rest of their lives as the moment when defeat turned into reprieve. The Luftwaffe's objective would shift from RAF airfields and infrastructure to the bombing of London and other cities. From that night on, what Londoners would call the Blitz began its 9-month course. From September 7th, 1940 to May 11th, 1941, the Luftwaffe bombed London for 57 consecutive nights and struck other industrial cities at intervals. The port of Liverpool was attacked for 8 straight nights in May 1941. Coventry was devastated on November 14, 1940, when a formation of 515 bombers destroyed its medieval cathedral, its automotive plants, and left more than 500 dead. The terror was real. The destruction was massive. But RAF airfields were no longer being attacked. Radar stations were no longer being targeted. Hurricane and Spitfire pilots had time to rest, to receive replacements, and to repair their aircraft on runways that were no longer being bombed every 48 hours. The RAF did not win the Battle of Britain in the skies of August. It won because Hitler, in a burst of personal rage, handed his adversaries the weeks they needed to recover. On September 15, 1940, what the British commemorate as Battle of Britain Day, German formations lost 60 aircraft against 26 British. It was a ratio the Luftwaffe could not sustain. On September 17th, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned amphibious invasion of Great Britain. On October 12th, he formally cancelled it until the spring of 1941. It was never resumed. The decision to shift targets on September 7th was not merely a tactical mistake. It was the consequence of a structural flaw in German decision-making that would repeat itself across all theaters of war: Hitler's ability to subordinate rational military calculations to his emotional impulses and ideological perceptions. A strategically coherent mind would have continued attacking the airfields for 2 more weeks. The RAF, deprived of its operational bases, might have lost its capacity for organized response. Without air superiority over the Channel, the German invasion fleet, composed of river barges requisitioned from ports along the Rhine and Moselle, might have attempted the crossing. The entire subsequent course of the war hinges on that possibility. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who directed Britain's air defense during the battle, wrote in his memoirs that in the last week of August 1940, his defense system was on the verge of collapse. That the Luftwaffe stopped attacking his bases was, in his words, the intervention of Providence that saved Britain. Providence had a name that September. It was called Adolf Hitler. The forgotten Mediterranean. The strategy that could have changed everything. There is a blue line on the maps of the Second World War that almost no one discusses and almost everyone overlooks. That line is the Suez Canal. In the autumn of 1940, while the Luftwaffe was beginning its bombing campaign over London and the German High Command was calculating the chances of invading Great Britain, there existed an alternative strategic approach that several of the most experienced advisors of the German High Command, including General Franz Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff, had identified as potentially decisive. The idea, never implemented on the necessary scale, was to concentrate the resources that Germany and Italy had available in the south and carry out a Mediterranean offensive to cut the British Empire's supply lines at their most vulnerable point, the narrow canal linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. On July 31st, 1940, at a meeting at the Berghof, General Walter von Brauchitsch and Halder himself presented Hitler with an analysis of the strategic options available. Among them was an explicit proposal to send panzer forces and aircraft to Libya to support the Italian army, which at that time controlled Cyrenaica, the eastern region of Libya, and launch a coordinated offensive toward Egypt. The ultimate objective would be the Suez Canal and, beyond it, the Middle East with its oil fields in Iraq and Iran. Hitler did not explicitly reject the proposal, but neither did he adopt it with the necessary conviction. Instead, he decided to send a blocking detachment, a limited expeditionary force to support the Italians. That detachment would become the Africa Corps. To understand what was at stake, one must grasp the geography of British imperial power in 1940. The United Kingdom maintained considerable forces in the Middle East, the Eighth Army in Egypt, garrisons in Palestine and Transjordan, and control over the oil fields of Iraq. The oil coming from Iran and Iraq, refined in Abadan and Haifa, was the fuel that kept the Mediterranean Fleet, the RAF, in North Africa, and a large part of Britain's war industry operational. The Suez Canal was not just a geographic route, it was the artery that connected the British Empire with its Asian and African resources. If that artery were cut, Britain's strategic position would deteriorate fundamentally. The question historians have asked for decades is, could Rommel have reached the Suez Canal if he had been given the necessary resources? General Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, in command of an expeditionary force that initially consisted of the 5th Light Panzer Division and the 15th Panzer Division. He was the kind of commander whose energy and audacity often compensated for his disregard of logistical lines. Rommel had risen in Hitler's favor in the autumn of 1940 precisely because of that quality. He had the ability to see opportunities where his superiors saw obstacles and to exploit an enemy's weaknesses before they had time to reorganize. Between March 1941 and July 1942, Rommel led the Africa Corps, later renamed Panzer Group Africa and then Panzer Army Africa, through a cycle of advances and retreats that spanned 2,000 kilometers of desert between Tripoli and El Alamein, just 100 kilometers west of Alexandria. In June 1942, he captured the fortress of Tobruk, which had withstood a 241-day siege in 1941. In barely a single day of fighting, taking 33,000 Allied soldiers prisoner and seizing enough supplies and fuel to continue his offensive. On July 1st, 1942, his forward elements reached the El Alamein position, where they were halted by the forces of General Claude Auchinleck. At that moment, the British High Command in Cairo experienced what historians euphemistically call the July Panic. Officers at the British Embassy burned their files in the gardens of the diplomatic mission. European civilians fled Cairo on overcrowded trains. The Mediterranean fleet under Admiral Andrew Cunningham began preparing contingency plans to abandon Alexandria. The India office in London started calculating the possibility of having to defend the Suez Canal from the east if it fell from the west. Rommel was 100 kilometers from Alexandria. He was 250 kilometers from the Suez Canal. But he did not get there. And the fundamental reason why he did not is the one that historians of the North African campaign consistently emphasize: logistics. The Africa Corps supply line depended on convoys crossing the central Mediterranean from the Italian ports of Naples and Brindisi to Tripoli or Benghazi. That 1,500-kilometer stretch of sea was constantly threatened by British air and naval forces based on Malta. The small island of Malta, a rocky outcrop of 316 square kilometers in the center of the Mediterranean, was the critical node in the line of communication that strangled the Afrika Korps. Between January and April 1942, the Luftwaffe subjected Malta to the most intense bombing of the war. It is estimated that more than 6,700 tons of bombs fell on the island during that period, more than fell on London during the entire Blitz. But Malta did not fall. And as long as it remained operational as an air and naval base, Italian convoys were attacked with an effectiveness that at times cost the Axis powers more than 30% of the tonnage sent to North Africa during certain months of 1941 to 1942. Why was Malta not taken? General Albert Kesselring, commander of the German Second Air Fleet based in Sicily, had designed in the spring of 1942 Operation Hercules, a combined Italo-German amphibious assault on Malta that would employ paratroop units, marine infantry divisions, and massive air cover. The plans were detailed and, according to several later analyses, had a real chance of success. The island had a garrison strong enough to resist, but studies of Operation Hercules projected that German fire superiority might have overcome those defenses within 1 to 2 weeks. Hitler vetoed the operation. His distrust of Italian military capabilities, since they would have had to provide most of the naval forces, and his apprehension about amphibious operations after the costly airborne assault on Crete in May 1941, where the German 7th Airborne Division suffered losses of more than 40% of its strength, led the Führer to prefer a bombing strategy that was militarily insufficient to force the island's surrender. The consequence was that Rommel never received the supplies he needed to complete the offensive. The OKH's instructions for the African theater set a logistical allocation of 30,000 tons of supplies per month for the Afrika Korps. Rommel rarely received more than 15,000. During the summer campaign of 1942, his tanks operated with fuel reserves sufficient for 24 hours of advance, instead of the 3 days required by his operational doctrine. Admiral Erich Raeder, head of the Kriegsmarine, had repeatedly advocated to Hitler during 1940 and 1941 for a strategy of indirect periphery that would prioritize the Mediterranean over a direct invasion of Great Britain or the premature opening of the Eastern Front. Raeder argued that the combination of an Atlantic blockade by submarines and a Mediterranean offensive that closed the Suez Canal would strangle the British war economy without the need to invade the islands. It was a strategic vision that anticipated by decades the modern concept of asymmetric pressure. Raeder found in Hitler a listener who heard but did not act. In his memoirs, Mein Leben, 1957, the admiral wrote that every time he presented his arguments about the strategic importance of the Mediterranean, Hitler listened politely, and then asked when the new generation of ocean-going submarines would be ready. Barbarossa, the calendar that changed the war, June 22, 1941, 3:30 in the morning. Along a 2,900-kilometer front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, 3.2 million German soldiers, supported by 3,600 tanks and more than 2,700 aircraft, crossed the Soviet border without a prior declaration of war. It was the largest military operation in human history. Operation Barbarossa began with a success that exceeded even the most optimistic estimates of the German General Staff. In the first 5 days of the campaign, Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock advanced 280 kilometers eastward and encircled 40 Soviet divisions in the Białystok-Minsk pocket. 323,000 soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 1,800 artillery pieces. The Soviet Air Force, caught on the ground at its airfields, was destroyed within the first 48 hours at a scale that even Luftwaffe Chief of Staff General Hans Jeschonek initially refused to believe. German pilot reports claimed more than 1,800 Soviet aircraft destroyed on the first day. General Georgy Zhukov, who was chief of the General Staff of the Red Army at the time, wrote in his memoir Wspomnienia I Razmyślenia that the confusion in the early hours of June 22nd was total. Entire units were receiving contradictory orders, telephone lines between commands were cut, and front commanders could not locate their subordinates. The problem for Germany was not the beginning of Barbarossa. The problem was a decision taken exactly 2 months later. In mid-July 1941, Army Group Center was halted east of Smolensk after completing another enormous Kessel, an encirclement pocket that had captured more than 310,000 Soviet prisoners in the battles of Smolensk and the Dnieper. Guderian's panzer units and those of General Hermann Hoth were located approximately 360 kilometers from Moscow. Soviet military engineers had laid minefields and anti-tank trenches on the approaches to the city, but the Red Army's strategic reserves for the defense of the capital were at that time in a condition that General Zhukov himself described as critical in a memorandum dated July 29, 1941, addressed to the Supreme Defense Council. Moscow in 1941 was not simply the symbolic capital of the Soviet Union. It was the central hub of the entire railway and communications network of European USSR. From Moscow radiated 11 major railway lines. German General Staff engineers had calculated that the capture of Moscow would mean not only the loss of the Soviet Military Coordination Center, but the collapse of the transport system that enabled forces to be redistributed across the vast Soviet theater of operations. Without Moscow, forces in the north and south would be virtually isolated from one another. Analyses by the Operations Working Group of the OKH, partially reproduced in the academic study Reinterpreting Operation Barbarossa, published in Parameters, the journal of the U.S. Army War College, conclude that the evidence is overwhelming that German army planners had drawn the correct conclusions in selecting Moscow as the primary objective of the campaign. Then Hitler intervened. On July 30, 1941, the Führer issued Directive 33, ordering Army Group Center to go on the defensive and instructing Guderian and Hoth to detach their panzer groups to support the northern and southern flanks. The objectives shifted to Leningrad in the north and Ukraine in the south, with the Donetsk Basin and its coal and steel industry as explicit economic priorities. Moscow was relegated to a secondary objective to be addressed later. The reaction of the High Command was one of consternation. General Franz Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff, wrote in his diary on August 11, 1941, one of the most frustrated entries in the military records of the war: "The superiority of the operational command of our army has been reduced to nothing." On August 22nd, Halder attempted to influence Hitler by arranging a meeting between the Führer and Guderian, hoping that the army's most charismatic general could persuade him. Guderian traveled to Hitler's headquarters at the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, a complex of bunkers in the forests of East Prussia, and presented his case with the direct clarity that characterized him. Moscow was the correct objective, the only one that could bring about the decisive defeat of the Red Army before winter. Hitler listened in silence. Then he approached the map, placed his hand over Ukraine, and began a lecture on the importance of the Ukrainian grain region and the Donetsk coal industry for the long war that lay ahead. Resources, not tactical victories, would be the key. Guderian left the meeting with orders to turn his entire 2nd Panzer Group south toward Kiev. The operational result of the diversion was, in tactical terms, spectacular. The Battle of Kiev became the largest defeat in the history of the Red Army up to that point. On September 19th, the city fell, and by September 25th, the encirclement pockets around 6 Soviet armies were closed. An estimated 665,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. The 1st Panzer Group under General Ewald von Kleist, advancing from the south, and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, advancing from the north, linked up on September 16th in the village of Lochwitza, 120 kilometers east of Kiev, sealing the largest encirclement pocket of the Second World War, but the price was time. The diversion of the two panzer groups from Army Group Center lasted 6.5 weeks. When Operation Typhoon, the final assault on Moscow, began on October 2, 1941, there were 40 fewer days of good weather available before the Russian autumn turned unpaved roads into rivers of mud that immobilized tanks and supply trucks. In OKH documents, this period is known as the Rasputitsa, the season without roads, and its arrival in October 1941 was, according to General Gunther Blumentritz analysis reproduced in Liddell Hart's work, as devastating to the advance as any Soviet division. Operation Typhoon began with devastating victories. In the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets between October 2nd and 14th, 1941, another 673,000 Soviet prisoners were captured. But the autumn mud halted the advance. When the winter freeze hardened the ground and the panzers were able to move again in early November, temperatures had fallen to -15 and -20 degrees Celsius. Tank lubricants, designed for Western European conditions, solidified. Aircraft fuel had to be heated before being loaded into tanks. German soldiers in summer uniforms, the campaign had been planned on the assumption of victory before winter, began suffering frostbite casualties that rivaled combat losses. On December 2, 1941, reconnaissance units of the 258th Infantry Division reached Khimki, a suburb northwest of Moscow, 5 kilometers from the city limits. It was the closest German forces would ever come to the Soviet capital. Through their binoculars, some officers reported being able to see the glint of the Kremlin's domes. The temperature was -38 degrees Celsius. On December 5, 1941, General Georgy Zhukov, who had replaced General Dmitry Pavlov as commander of Moscow's defense, launched a counter-offensive with 100 reserve divisions, many of them transferred from Siberia after Soviet agent Richard Sorge reported from Tokyo that Japan would not attack the USSR from the east. The Germans, exhausted with worn-out equipment and supply lines stretched to the limit, gave ground along the entire central front. The 1941 campaign ended without a decisive outcome. What would have happened if Guderian and Hoth had not been diverted toward Kiev in August? According to the analysis of the US Army War College, the capture of Moscow before the Rasputitsa was technically feasible. The distances were traversable, the Soviet defending forces were in worse condition than in October, and the psychological and logistical impact of losing the capital would have been qualitatively different from the loss of Kiev or Kharkov. Zhukov himself admitted in post-war interviews recorded in Harrison Salisbury's The Unknown War, 1978, that if the attack had arrived in August instead of October, the situation would have been extremely difficult. Winter and the war economy. The chains Germany put on itself. The Soviet winter of 1941 arrived with a brutality that German general staff planners had consciously or unconsciously chosen to ignore. Meteorological records show that the winter of 1941 to 1942 in European Russia was the coldest since 1812, the same winter that defeated Napoleon, with temperatures in some sectors of the front reaching -50 degrees Celsius. The Wehrmacht was not equipped for that cold because no one in the high command had wanted to plan for a Russian winter. Doing so would have meant admitting that Barbarossa might last longer than 4 months. But the cold was only the most visible symptom of a deeper structural problem, the German war economy. There is one statistic that captures better than any other the fundamental contradiction of the Nazi regime in 1939. When German troops crossed the Polish border on September 1st, the German army had ammunition sufficient for approximately 6 weeks of intense combat. That figure, recorded in the reports of General Georg Thomas, head of the War Economy Office of the OKW and cited by historian Adam Tooze in his exhaustive study, The Wages of Destruction, The Making and Breaking of the Nazi Economy, 2006, is not hypothetical. It reflects the real level of preparedness with which the Reich entered the war its own leader had initiated. The paradox was almost comical in its severity. From 1933 onward, Germany had built the most ambitious rearmament program in European peacetime history, spending sums that by 1939 amounted to 23% of its gross national product, compared with 7% for Britain and 6.8% for France. The four-year plan of 1936, nominally overseen by Hermann Göring, had promised to make Germany self-sufficient in strategic raw materials and ready for total war within 4 years. By 1939, Germany still depended on foreign imports for 1/3 of its raw material needs. Autarky was an aspiration, not a reality. Why? The answer has several layers. First, Hitler never conceived the war of 1939 as the war he would actually fight. His strategic vision, articulated in private conversations and in the document known as the Second Book, a text that remained unpublished until 1961, was that Germany should build a vast continental bloc of Euro-Asian power that would eventually allow it, sometime in the 1940s or 1950s, to confront the United States from a position of strength. The War of 1939 was premature within that framework. It was triggered by circumstances, the British guarantee to Poland, Poland's refusal to negotiate before Germany's industrial and logistical base was prepared to sustain a long war. Second, the Nazi economic management system suffered from bureaucratic fragmentation that made coherent long-term planning almost impossible. Historian Richard Overy, in Why the Allies Won, 1995, documents that at the time of Albert Speer's appointment as Minister of Armaments in February 1942, no fewer than 5 Supreme Reich-level agencies were simultaneously competing for control of war production. Göring's four-year plan office, Thomas's War Economy Office within the OKW, the Ministries of Labour and Economics, Speer's Inherited Armaments Office, and Himmler's SS Economic Office. Each operated with its own priorities, its own supply chains, and its own contracts with private industry. The result was massive duplication of effort, irrational allocation of scarce raw materials, and an inability to achieve economies of scale in production. When Speer assumed control in February 1942, he began implementing what he called industrial self-responsibility. Committees of civilian industrialists specialized in each production sector replaced military bureaucrats in managing armaments programs. Output increased significantly. Between spring 1942 and summer 1944, total German armaments production tripled. Tank production rose from 3,290 units in 1941 to 10,198 in 1943. Aircraft production increased from 8,295 to 24,807 over the same period. But these numbers had a date. They came too late. The Soviet Union, which in the first 6 months of Barbarossa had lost 63% of its coal production, 68% of its iron smelting capacity, and 60% of its aluminum output, industries that before the war had been concentrated in the western regions now occupied by the Germans, achieved an industrial miracle without parallel in modern history. Between June 1941 and March 1942, more than 1,500 entire factories were dismantled and transported by rail east of the Urals, beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. Entire factories with their machinery, engineers, and in some cases their families, crossed 3,000 kilometers over the Siberian permafrost. The Kharkov tank factory was re-established in Chelyabinsk, a city renamed by its workers as Tankograd, the city of tanks, and by December 1941, while the Germans were freezing outside Moscow, it was producing T-34 tanks at a rate of 35 per day. The comparison of industrial output for 1942 is devastating for German prospects. The Soviet Union produced 24,446 tanks and armored vehicles that year, compared with 9,200 for Germany. Aircraft, 25,436 Soviet versus 15,409 German. Artillery pieces, 127,000 Soviet versus 44,000 German. And this was before the flow of American Lend-Lease aid began arriving in significant quantities. By the time Speer reformed the German armaments economy and began producing at competitive volumes, the Allies had closed the qualitative gap in tank technology, with the Soviet T-34/85 and IS-2, had achieved air superiority over Europe with the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt, and had opened 3 simultaneous fronts. The Eastern Front with the USSR, the Italian Front following the July 1943 landings, and from June 1944 onward, the Western Front in Normandy. The industrial window of opportunity had already closed. The mistake was not only the delay in mobilizing the economy for total war, it was a decision Hitler made consciously, revealing the regime's internal contradictions. Germany resisted using German women as a labor force in factories because it conflicted with Nazi ideology regarding women's domestic role. While Britain and the Soviet Union were massively integrating women into their war industries, the image of Rosie the Riveter in the United States or the female brigades in the Tankergrad factories became icons of the era. Germany kept women largely out of industrial production for doctrinal reasons. It partially compensated with forced labor from prisoners of war and deported workers from occupied territories. An estimated 7 million forced laborers were working in German industry by late 1944, but this solution created its own inefficiencies. Unskilled workers, lack of motivation, and conditions that severely reduced productivity. The analysis of the Strategic Bombing Survey of October 1945, the most comprehensive Allied study of the German war economy, concludes, "There is no doubt that Germany began the conversion of its economy to a war footing too late. If the leaders of Germany had decided to make a total war effort in 1939 instead of 1942, they would have had time to arm in depth, that is, to lay the foundations of a war economy by expanding its basic industries. Beginning its armament program as late as 1942, it could only arm in breadth." The declaration no one ordered, December 11, 1941. On December 7, 1941, at 7:55 a.m. Hawaiian time, 353 combat aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy began their attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. In 2 waves lasting less than 2 hours, 8 battleships of the United States Pacific Fleet were sunk or damaged, and 2,403 American soldiers and civilians were killed. The following day, the United States Congress declared war on Japan with only 1 dissenting vote. In Berlin, where it was 6 p.m. on December 7th when the first reports from Pearl Harbor arrived, the atmosphere at Hitler's headquarters was one of euphoria. The Führer had been facing weeks of bad news from the Eastern Front, the failure of Operation Typhoon, the Soviet counter-offensive of December 5th, and the news of the Japanese attack came as a relief. Hitler telephoned Goering, who received the call aboard his special train Asia near Nuremberg, and conveyed the news with an optimism that surprised the Marshal. "This turn of events," Hitler reportedly said, according to Goering's account, "frees us from having to be the first to attack the Americans." On December 11, 1941, Hitler convened the Reichstag at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin. Before the members of the Reichstag and the foreign press gathered in the galleries, he read a formal declaration of war against the United States of America. The speech lasted 90 minutes. Mussolini declared war the same day from Rome. There was no legal obligation to do so. The Tripartite Pact, signed on September 27, 1940, between Germany, Italy and Japan, only committed the parties to mutual assistance if one of them was attacked by a power not already involved in the war. Japan had struck first. Germany and the United States were not formally at war. Historian Gerhard Weinberg, in his work A World at Arms, A Global History of World War II, 1994, notes that this legal detail would have been sufficient for Roosevelt to delay or avoid war with Germany. Gallup polls at the time showed that only around 30% of Americans supported war with Germany if the country had not been directly attacked. The consequences of the German declaration were exactly the opposite of what Hitler appeared to expect. Roosevelt, who had spent nearly 2 years trying to involve the United States in the European war without overcoming congressional and public isolationism, was handed by Hitler the political pretext he needed to declare war on Germany with unanimous support from Congress and public opinion. Germany first, a strategic priority agreed between Roosevelt and Churchill at the Arcadia Conference of December 1941 to January 1942, became the guiding framework of Allied strategy. What happens if Hitler simply does not declare war on the United States? The most likely scenario, according to scholars of the period, including historian Brendan Sims in Hitler, Only the World Was Enough, 2019, is that Roosevelt would have faced significant resistance in Congress and public opinion to opening a second front in Europe while the war in the Pacific demanded all available resources. The Lend-Lease program already existed and would have continued. Britain and the Soviet Union would still have received supplies, but the difference between receiving war material and having the army of the world's most powerful industrial nation physically present on European soil is immeasurable. The inertia of the war in the Pacific was enormous. American public opinion was outraged by Pearl Harbor, not by what was happening in Europe. American generals, including General George C. Marshall, had to allocate available resources across two oceans: the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942 and in Normandy in June 1944 would, at best, have been delayed, at worst cancelled. The December 11, 1941 declaration of war made the world's only remaining industrial superpower at that time a direct enemy of Germany. With it, Hitler handed Roosevelt the political authority to turn the most productive economy on the planet into a war machine. By 1944, American factories would produce 96,000 aircraft, 17,000 tanks and self-propelled artillery pieces, and 45,000 naval vessels of various types. None of the Axis war economies combined came close to these figures. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the OKW, stated at the Nuremberg trials that on the evening of December 11, 1941, as he left the Reichstag after the declaration of war, he knew that Germany had lost the war. Not immediately, he added, but definitively. The East with no return, Stalingrad and the point where defeat became certainty, August 1942. Temperatures in the Russian steppe exceed 40 degrees Celsius. The ground is dry and cracked. On the horizon, a column of black smoke rises from burning oil tanks on the banks of the Volga. The city bearing Stalin's name is on fire. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was at that moment advancing towards Stalingrad as part of Operation Blue, the 1942 summer offensive, whose declared strategic objective was the oil regions of the Caucasus and the industrial city on the Volga, controlling the river arteries of southern Russia. The Sixth Army consisted of 270,000 men, more than 3,000 guns and howitzers, with the 4th Panzer Army in support. It was the most powerful formation Germany had deployed on a single front during the entire war. What happened in Stalingrad between August 1942 and February 1943 has been recounted in dozens of major historical works, from Vasily Grossman's Chronicle Life and Fate, the manuscript the Soviet regime attempted to confiscate, to Antony Beevor's academic analysis Stalingrad, The Fateful Siege, 1998. What concerns us here is not the battle itself, but the decision-making mechanisms that led Germany into it. Operation Blue had a clear economic objective: the oil fields of Maikop, Grozny and Baku in the Caucasus. Germany consumed approximately 10 million tons of oil per year and produced less than 3 domestically. Synthetic fuel from the hydrogenation plants of the Ruhr and Silesia covered part of the gap, as did Romanian oil from Ploiesti. But the shortfall was real and growing as the war intensified. Capturing the Caucasus oil regions would have closed that gap in one stroke. The problem was that the German operational design split forces into 2 diverging axes, one toward the Caucasus with Army Group A and one toward Stalingrad with Army Group B. By advancing simultaneously in 2 directions that moved away from each other, a widening triangle of exposure was created, one that proved highly vulnerable to Soviet counterattacks. The flanks of the German advance, particularly in the Don sector northwest of Stalingrad, were entrusted to lower-quality Allied armies, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies and the Italian 8th Army. These forces were poorly equipped for Soviet armored and artillery warfare. Operation Uranus, planned by Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky and launched on November 19, 1942, exploited precisely these weaknesses. 2 Soviet armored pincer movements, the northern thrust under General Nikolai Vatutin and the southern under General Andrei Yeremenko, broke through the Romanian positions and linked up on November 23 in the town of Calacan-Don, 80 kilometers west of Stalingrad. General Paulus's 6th Army was encircled. Hitler prohibited breaking out of the encirclement. "German soldiers do not surrender," he declared. and ordered Paulus to hold out until a relief force launched by Army Group Don under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein could break the Soviet perimeter from the outside. Operation Winter Storm, launched on December 12, 1942, reached within 48 kilometers of the Sixth Army's perimeter before being halted by the Soviet counter-offensive. Paulus could have attempted a breakout from within at that point. Manstein pleaded with him by radio, but Hitler gave no authorization, and Paulus did not act without it. On January 31, 1943, Friedrich Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler the previous night, apparently in the expectation that the honor would compel him to commit suicide rather than surrender, signed the capitulation of the forces in the southern sector. On February 2nd, the last pocket of resistance in the northern sector laid down its arms. 91,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, including 24 generals and the Field Marshal himself. Of these, fewer than 6,000 would return alive to Germany after the war. Total German losses, killed, wounded, missing and captured, exceeded 800,000 over the summer and autumn campaign of 1942. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. The Nazi Party, which since 1933 had built its legitimacy on a rhetoric of invincibility, faced for the first time a defeat that could not be presented as a tactical maneuver or softened by euphemism. Stalingrad was the moment when German public opinion, monitored closely by the Gestapo through the Meldungen aus dem Reich, the internal situation reports from within the Reich, began for the first time in significant numbers to contemplate the possibility of defeat. Operation Uranus, in addition to destroying the Sixth Army, unleashed a chain of Red Army offensives that would continue, without full interruption, until May 1945. Kursk in July 1943, Operation Bagration in June 1944, which destroyed Army Group Center with approximately 350,000 German dead and prisoners in 3 weeks, the worst military defeat in German history. The Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, which in 18 days advanced 480 kilometers and brought Soviet forces to the banks of the Oder River, 70 kilometers from Berlin. Each of these operations had its strategic foundation in the defeat at Stalingrad. The Red Army had mastered large-scale armored and artillery warfare. Its generals, Zhukov, Vatutin, Konev, Rokossovsky, Vasilevsky, had developed an operational skill comparable to that of the best German commanders of 1941. And Soviet industry, reorganized east of the Urals, was producing at levels that German industry, despite Speer's reforms, could not match. The ballistic missile program had begun in 1932, 2 years before Hitler came to power. Its origins lay in the Society for Space Travel, Verein für Raumschifffahrt, and in liquid fuel rocket experiments that von Braun had begun as a student at the Berlin Institute of Technology. The German army saw the rocket as a way to circumvent the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, which prohibited heavy artillery but did not explicitly mention rockets. However, the program did not receive the priority and resources its engineers demanded during the critical years between 1939 and 1942. Hitler, who never fully understood basic rocket physics, showed for years an indifference or even hostility toward the program, as reflected in memoirs and accounts from his close staff. It was not until a visit to the Peenemünde test site in July 1943, when von Braun showed him a launch film, that Hitler became enthusiastic about the missile and began referring to it as the decisive weapon that would reverse the course of the war. By the time the first V-2 hit London on September 8, 1944, its first civilian victims falling in the Chiswick district in West London, the strategic situation of Germany was already irrecoverable. Operation Overlord had taken place 3 months earlier. Army Group Center had been destroyed in Operation Bagration. Romania and Bulgaria had abandoned the Axis. The V-2 program, which ultimately relied on more than 100,000 forced laborers in the underground factories of Mittelwerk in the Harz Mountains, of whom an estimated 12,000 died under the working conditions, produced 3,172 operational missiles, of which 1,359 struck Great Britain and 1,736 targeted Belgium, mainly Antwerp. They caused terror, destruction, and more than 7,000 deaths. They did not change the course of the war. The broken mirror. Why Germany could not win being what it was. There is a question that underlies all the strategic analyses examined in this narrative and transcends them. If so many German mistakes are identifiable and, in hindsight, avoidable, why were they not avoided? Why did a regime capable of carefully planning the 1940 campaign in France or the opening phase of Barbarossa in 1941 commit strategic errors that its own generals were identifying in real time? The answer requires looking not only at battles and tactical decisions, but at the structure of power in the Third Reich. The Third Reich, in its actual functioning, was a system of personalist rule in which the will of a single man took absolute precedence over any institutional, technical, or professional consideration. The Führerprinzip, the leader principle, was not merely a propaganda doctrine. It was the organizing principle of the entire state apparatus. Generals who disagreed with Hitler could express their opinion once and perhaps twice, but if the Führer maintained his position, disagreement ceased to be tolerable. General Ludwig Beck, who resigned as Chief of the General Staff in August 1938 precisely because he refused to execute a policy he considered suicidal for Germany, was the exception that defined the rule. The rest learned to adapt, to persuade at the margins, and to carry out orders they believed to be wrong. The German historian Hans Ulrich Wehler, in his Deutsche Gesellschaftsgeschichte, 1987-2008, describes the Nazi power structure as a polycratic chaos in which different factions of the party, the army, the SS, and economic institutions competed for the Führer's favor, rather than for operational efficiency. This horizontal competition generated duplication of effort, bureaucratic sabotage, and a systemic inability to establish clear priorities. When Speer in 1942 attempted to centralize armaments production, he had to fight simultaneously against Göring, Himmler, Bormann, and regional party officials across the Reich. That he succeeded in tripling production in such a context is almost more remarkable than the fact that he could not do so earlier. But there is an additional, deeper, and more disturbing dimension that no strategic analysis can ignore. The racial ideology of Nazism was not a decorative element of the regime. It was the core of its policy and operational decisions. The decision to massacre and enslave the populations of the conquered eastern territories, instead of using them as potential allies against the Soviet regime, as some officers of the Wehrmacht and the Abwehr had proposed, was not a bureaucratic anomaly. It was the logical consequence of a worldview that classified Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, subhumans, destined for servitude or extermination. This ideology had concrete and devastating military consequences. When German divisions entered Ukraine in the summer of 1941, the initial response of a significant part of the Ukrainian population was one of genuine ambivalence, if not relief. The Soviet regime had violently collectivized farms, had executed or deported hundreds of thousands of peasants during the 1932-1933 Holodomor famine, and the memory of that terror was still fresh. Some Ukrainian volunteer units were even formed to fight alongside the Germans, but the behavior of the SS and the Einsatzgruppen, mobile extermination units that followed regular divisions and executed Jews, communists, political commissars, and anyone classified as undesirable, quickly turned initial ambivalence into active resistance. Ukrainian peasants who might have provided intelligence, guides, and local supplies to an occupying army that treated them as human beings instead became the social base of the Soviet partisan movement, which behind German lines grew from 1942 onward to between 700,000 and 1 million fighters. Historian Alexander Dalin, in his work German Rule in Russia, 1941 to 1945, 1957, the most exhaustive academic study of German occupation policy in the Soviet territories, estimates that if the Nazi regime had treated the conquered populations with a minimum of respect and had allowed a degree of local autonomy, as advocated by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of the Abwehr and General Ernst Köstring, the OKH's expert on Russian affairs, the partisan resistance movement would have been far weaker, and the logistical cost of maintaining the Eastern Front's supply lines would have been significantly reduced. In contrast, the occupied territories became laboratories of administered terror. The Reich Commissariat for Ukraine, headed by Erich Koch, a party official who described his work as that of a black subordinate serving the Reich, referring contemptuously to the populations he governed, implemented requisition policies that emptied Ukrainian granaries, reduced civilian rations to subsistence levels, and turned civil administration into an instrument of extraction and terror. Koch was personally responsible for the death by starvation, forced labor, and executions of more than 1 million civilians in Ukraine. It is not possible to separate these crimes from strategic analysis, not as a moral reflection external to the argument, but as a constitutive part of it. Every grain depot emptied that fed a partisan army instead of a German soldier was a direct consequence of Koch's policies and those designed in Berlin. Every Ukrainian civilian turned into a guerrilla fighter was a resource that might otherwise have been on the opposite side of the front line. Nazi racial ideology was not only morally abhorrent, it was strategically self-defeating. General Ernst Köstring, who knew Russia better than almost any other German officer after spending more than 2 decades in the country, wrote in an internal OKH memorandum in August 1941 that the occupation policy being implemented in the East will, in the medium term, produce a mobilization effect among the Soviet population that no number of panzer divisions will be able to offset. The memorandum was filed away. Köstring was removed from his advisory role on matters concerning the eastern populations. There is a remark by General Alfred Jodl, made during his interrogation at Nuremberg in 1945 and recorded in the proceedings of the International Military Tribunal, that captures this dimension with a clarity no academic analysis can improve upon. We fought the wrong enemy on the wrong front with the wrong methods because they were designed to fulfill objectives that were not military. The counterfactual and its limits. Imagine a map of Europe in January 1942. On that map, the borders are different from the ones we know. Danzig has been German since 1938, obtained in a conference rather than in a war. Britain is exhausted but intact, negotiating an uneasy peace after its army was captured at Dunkirk and its air force was shattered in the skies over southern England. The Soviet Union has lost Moscow, its communications hub, and the war in the East continues with an uncertain outcome. The United States, without formal provocation in Europe, is fighting primarily in the Pacific. The Suez Canal may be under German control. This map is possible, but it requires that at every branching point examined in this narrative, the decision taken had been the opposite of what was taken in reality. It requires a Germany that is diplomatically patient in 1938 and 1939, militarily ruthless at Dunkirk, strategically coherent in the Battle of Britain, economically prepared for total war from day one, capable of refraining from declaring war on the most powerful nation in the world without direct provocation, and free from the racial ideology that turned every conquered territory into a potential enemy. It requires, in essence, a Germany that was not Nazi Germany. And there lies the fundamental limit of all counterfactual analysis. Hitler's strategic mistakes were not isolated accidents of a man who, under different circumstances, might have been a great strategist. They were the logical consequence of what Hitler was, a racial ideologue who believed history was a biological struggle between races, that time was against Germany because it represented the healthiest race at the peak of its power, and that war was not only inevitable but desirable as an instrument of national selection and strengthening. Every error examined here was, from within that system of values, a logical outcome of that worldview. The diplomatic patience of 1938 to 1939 was incompatible with a worldview in which only war could forge a superior race. Restraint at Dunkirk was difficult for a man whose political standing within the regime depended on total, spectacular victories rather than negotiated settlements. The shift of objectives in the Battle of Britain was the consequence of a political culture in which personal pride and the Führer's public image outweighed cold strategic calculation. The declaration of war on the United States was the expression of a global vision in which confrontation with world Jewish power was seen as inevitable, and any delay as cowardice. Historian Evan Burr Bucke, in his contribution to the collection Why the Allies Won, Explaining Victory in World War II, 2012, concludes that analyzing Hitler's mistakes from a rational strategic perspective is useful for understanding the mechanics of German defeat, but it can create the illusion that those mistakes were avoidable within the political system that produced them. They were not, or at least not systematically. However, understanding these mechanisms has value that goes beyond the intellectual exercise. It allows us to see how systems of power that concentrate authority in a single individual generate systematic and uncorrectable errors. How ideologies that dehumanize the adversary create the conditions for their own defeat. How the separation between those who decide and those who possess the knowledge necessary to decide well is historically a recipe for disaster. And how wars are not won by armies alone, but also by economies, diplomatic alliances, and a regime's capacity not to turn potential enemies into actual allies of its adversaries. The Third Reich existed for 12 years, from January 1933 to May 1945. In those 12 years, it murdered approximately 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war through deliberate starvation and mistreatment, and hundreds of thousands of disabled people, homosexuals, political dissidents, and Roma. Between 70 and 85 million people died in the war it unleashed, depending on how indirect deaths from famine and disease are counted. About half of them were civilians. There was no reasonably humane way in which Germany could have won the Second World War because no humanly modified version of Nazism was compatible with the conditions its own victory would have required. What the strategic analyses examined throughout this narrative reveal is not a path to German victory, but the logic of defeat embedded in the regime itself from the very beginning. That is what history reveals when it is examined without the blinders of the mythology of the frustrated genius or the avoidable accident. There was no alternative Hitler waiting to make the correct decisions. There was a system that produced the kinds of decisions it was capable of producing and that led Germany and Europe and the world into the greatest catastrophe of the modern era.